The opening of the message is engineered to seize attention with immediate force, bypassing casual curiosity and moving directly into psychological capture. Rather than easing the listener into a topic, it interrupts their ordinary media consumption with a declarative tone that signals urgency, importance, and exclusivity. This is not framed as content one may choose to engage with, but as a moment one is already implicated in. From the first seconds, the listener is positioned not as an audience member, but as a participant in an unfolding event. The introduction does not ask for interest, it presumes relevance. The first mechanism employed is honorific identity assignment. By addressing the listener as chosen one or esteemed child of God, the message confers elevated status before any evidence, agreement, or action has occurred. This title functions psychologically as a reward offered up front. It bypasses skepticism by flattering the self-concept of the listener, inviting identification rather than evaluation. Once the listener accepts the address, even passively, they are no longer neutral. To reject the message would require rejecting the elevated identity that has just been offered, which creates an immediate emotional cost to disengagement. This identity assignment also functions as a preemptive filter. By declaring that the message is intended only for a specific, rare group, the introduction establishes an in-group/out-group boundary before any claims are tested. Those who resonate are implicitly confirmed as chosen, while those who do not are framed as simply not part of the intended audience. This construction protects the message from falsification. Disbelief is not evidence against the claim, it is reinterpreted as proof that the listener does not belong to the group. In this way, skepticism is neutralized, not through argument, but through exclusion. Simultaneously, the introduction frames the message as a time-specific divine interruption.
The listener is told, explicitly or implicitly, that this is not general teaching, inspiration, or commentary. It is presented as a sealed word, delivered at a precise, cosmic moment. Language emphasizing right now, this exact moment, and appointed time, collapses temporal distance and creates a sense of immediacy. The listener is led to believe that hesitation, distraction, or delay carries real consequences, not because of missing information, but because of missing alignment with a fleeting window of destiny. This time-locking strategy introduces scarcity, one of the most powerful attention control mechanisms. The message implies that it will not repeat, that the opportunity to receive or respond exists only now. Scarcity transforms passive listening into pressured compliance. The listener is not encouraged to reflect, revisit, or cross-check. They are urged to remain present, alert, and obedient. The fear of loss, missing the moment, forfeiting destiny, or losing divine favor replaces curiosity as the primary motivator for continued attention. To further collapse skepticism, the introduction eliminates randomness. The message does not claim that the listener found the video. It insists that the video found the listener. This reversal is crucial. It removes agency from the audience and assigns intention to the content itself. Algorithms, coincidence, and chance are dismissed or overwritten by divine orchestration. By doing so, the introduction reframes an ordinary technological encounter as metaphysical selection. The listener is no longer watching a video, they are being addressed. This elimination of randomness also serves a deeper psychological function. It resolves uncertainty retroactively. Many listeners arrive with vague feelings, restlessness, loneliness, longing, or confusion, without clear narratives to explain them.
The introduction validates these sensations without specificity, describing dreams, emotional pulls, inner stirring, or a sense that something is about to change. Because these experiences are common and ambiguous, they allow for broad identification. Once validated,
they are immediately reinterpreted as evidence of divine communication, rather than normal psychological or emotional states. This reframing converts uncertainty into confirmation. Crucially, the validation of these sensations occurs before any claim is made about their meaning. The listener feels seen first, then instructed. This sequencing builds trust. By the time the message assigns interpretation, declaring these sensations to be signs of chosenness or impending alignment, the listener is already emotionally invested. Skepticism is less likely because the message appears to explain something the listener already feels, rather than imposing something new. Another key feature of the introduction is the repositioning of the speaker. The voice does not present itself as a teacher, guide, or fellow seeker. Instead, it adopts the posture of a messenger, delivering a finalized decree. The tone is declarative rather than exploratory, prophetic rather than instructional. There is no invitation to dialogue, interpretation, or disagreement. The authority claimed is not personal expertise, but delegated transcendence. The speaker does not argue, they announce. This posture is reinforced through legalistic and bureaucratic metaphors drawn from religious imagination. Assignments, appointments, sealing, authorization. These metaphors frame the spiritual realm as procedural and hierarchical, rather than relational or interpretive. The listener is not invited to discern truth collaboratively. They are expected to receive a verdict. This courtroom-like framing subtly discourages critical thought, as verdicts are not debated by defendants, they are accepted or enforced. The introduction also introduces inevitability. Something, the listener is told, is already in motion. The process has begun. The alignment is underway. The decision has been made in heaven. This language removes the possibility of opting out without consequence. If events are already unfolding, then resistance becomes obstruction rather than choice. The listener's role is reduced to compliance or misalignment. Agency narrows, but dignity is preserved by framing obedience as wisdom rather than submission. Importantly, inevitability also serves to preempt disappointment. If future claims fail to materialize, the narrative can shift responsibility to timing, readiness, or interference rather than error. Because the process is described as ongoing and unseen, absence of evidence becomes evidence of hidden activity. This ensures narrative continuity, even in the face of unmet expectations. Throughout the introduction, emotional pressure is applied without overt threat. There are no explicit punishments described yet, but the structure implies stakes: missing the moment, failing the assignment, remaining unaligned. These implied losses function more powerfully than explicit warnings because they allow the listener's imagination to fill the gaps. Fear remains ambient rather than articulated, which makes it harder to confront directly. The introduction's final achievement is attention collapse. By combining elevated identity, time scarcity, elimination of randomness, validation of inner states, and authoritative delivery, the message closes off alternative frames of interpretation. The listener is no longer asking, "Is this true?" but "What does this mean for me?" That shift from evaluation to self-implication is the central success of the introduction. At this point, the listener is primed. They are emotionally elevated, temporally pressured, identity affirmed, and cognitively narrowed. Skepticism has not been argued against. It has been rendered socially and emotionally costly.
To doubt now would mean stepping out of the chosen group, dismissing one's own internal experiences, and risking the loss of a perceived destiny moment. In this way, the introduction accomplishes its core purpose. It transforms a piece of online content into a perceived sacred encounter. Attention is no longer casual, it is reverent. The listener does not merely continue watching, they submit their focus, emotions, and interpretive authority to the narrative that follows. The rest of the message does not need to convince, it only needs to build upon a foundation that has already been accepted as significant, personal,
and divinely timed. After attention has been seized and identity elevated, the narrative turns toward one of the listener's most emotionally charged vulnerabilities: loneliness, rejection, and prolonged emotional pain. This phase is critical because it addresses experiences that are both deeply personal and difficult to falsify. Rather than challenging these experiences or offering practical explanations, the message performs a reframing maneuver that transforms pain from a potential point of doubt into structural reinforcement of the narrative itself. The core move is a reinterpretation of loneliness. Social isolation, emotional distance, and the sense of not belonging, experiences that often generate shame or self-blame, are recoded as intentional, divinely orchestrated strategy. Loneliness is no longer accidental, circumstantial, or the result of relational breakdown. It is presented as purposeful separation. This reframing immediately relieves the listener of social failure while simultaneously preventing alternative interpretations from emerging. By declaring isolation to be intentional, the narrative removes the need for evidence. No external verification is required because the proof is internal and experiential. The listener's pain becomes self-authenticating.
If they feel lonely, misunderstood, or isolated, that feeling itself is taken as confirmation that the narrative applies to them. This creates a closed loop. Suffering validates chosenness, and chosenness explains suffering. Importantly, this move neutralizes shame without restoring agency. Shame is removed by asserting that loneliness is not the listener's fault. It is not due to inadequacy, poor choices, or relational deficits. However, agency is not returned. The listener is not encouraged to examine patterns, seek mutual repair, or actively change circumstances. Instead, they are positioned as passive recipients of a divine process already underway. Relief is offered, but autonomy is not. The narrative further intensifies this reframing by presenting separation as refinement. Isolation is described not merely as purposeful, but as necessary preparation. The listener is told that distance from others was required to shape, sharpen, and strengthen them. This implies that connection before this moment would have been premature or even dangerous. Past relationships that failed or never materialized are retroactively reclassified as unsuitable by design, not by chance or incompatibility. This mechanism performs two psychological functions at once. First, it protects the listener from regret. If loneliness was necessary training, then no alternative past could have been better. Missed connections, failed relationships, and lost time are reframed as unavoidable components of destiny, rather than opportunities lost. Second, it discourages future experimentation. If separation was divinely mandated before, then connection must also be divinely sanctioned later. The listener learns not to trust organic relational processes, but to wait for narrative authorization. Crucially, the validation of suffering occurs without specificity or accountability. The message acknowledges tears, pain, rejection, and misunderstanding in broad terms that apply to nearly anyone who has experienced emotional difficulty. There is no inquiry into context, behavior, mutual responsibility, or relational dynamics. This omission is strategic. Specificity would invite scrutiny and differentiation. Vagueness allows universal identification. Once suffering is validated in this way, it is converted into proof of chosenness. Emotional pain becomes evidence that the listener is different, marked, and set apart. The very traits that might otherwise prompt self-reflection, alienation, restlessness, dissatisfaction, are inverted into status symbols. Pain is no longer something to be resolved. It is something to be honored. The listener does not heal from loneliness. They reinterpret it as confirmation. This conversion has a powerful stabilizing effect on belief. If suffering proves chosenness, then relief becomes paradoxically threatening. Improvement in social connection, emotional stability, or belonging
could undermine the narrative by removing the very evidence that supports it. As a result, the listener may unconsciously resist experiences that would contradict the story, preferring familiar pain that feels meaningful over unfamiliar health that feels ambiguous. At the same time, the narrative carefully preserves dependence on itself. While shame is removed, resolution is deferred. The listener is told that isolation had a purpose, but that purpose is not yet complete. Full relief is always positioned in the next phase, the next alignment, the next revelation, the next divine meeting. This creates a temporal dependency. The narrative becomes the only framework through which pain can be interpreted, endured, and eventually redeemed. Another key element is the absence of falsifiability. Because loneliness is framed as intentional and internal, there is no condition under which the narrative can be disproven.
Continued isolation confirms refinement. Emotional distress confirms sensitivity. Rejection confirms difference. Even doubt can be reframed as spiritual warfare or residual wounding. The system absorbs all outcomes without needing to revise its core claims. The listener is also subtly discouraged from seeking alternative explanations or support systems. If loneliness is divinely designed, then seeking social integration, therapy, or external validation may feel like interference rather than healing. The narrative does not explicitly forbid these actions, but it renders them spiritually secondary or suspect. True resolution is positioned as something that arrives only through divine orchestration, not human effort or relational negotiation. This structure also preserves moral superiority. The listener is not lonely because they are difficult, avoidant, or misaligned. They are lonely because they are advanced, refined, and set apart. This protects self-esteem while simultaneously isolating the listener from feedback that could challenge the narrative. Others who do not share the experience are implicitly less prepared, less aware, or less chosen. Finally, by reframing pain as proof rather than problem, the narrative ensures emotional endurance without empowerment. The listener learns to tolerate distress, not because they are equipped to change it, but because it has been given meaning. Meaning replaces agency. Endurance replaces action. Hope is deferred, not grounded. In sum, this function transforms loneliness from a destabilizing force into a stabilizing one. It removes shame while maintaining dependence. It validates suffering while preventing resolution. It honors pain without addressing its causes. And most importantly, it binds the listener more tightly to the narrative by making their most difficult emotions indispensable evidence of its truth. Once loneliness has been reinterpreted as purposeful rather than pathological, the narrative introduces its emotional payoff, a promised future connection. This move is not simply comforting, it is structurally necessary. Without a forward-facing reward, prolonged isolation would eventually destabilize the listener's attachment to the message. The promise of an imminent, divinely appointed relationship resolves that tension, while keeping the listener invested. The first maneuver is the announcement of a coming connection. This is framed not as a possibility or opportunity, but as a certainty, already scheduled within a transcendent plan. The listener is told they are not merely hoping for connection, they are awaiting it. This distinction matters. Hope implies uncertainty and agency. Awaiting implies inevitability and passivity. The future relationship is positioned as something that will arrive, not something that must be built, chosen, or negotiated. Crucially, the connection is framed as mission-critical rather than optional. It is not companionship for comfort, nor relationship for mutual growth. It is an assignment, an alignment, a divine strategy. This elevates the promised relationship above ordinary human bonds and shields it from ordinary relational evaluation. Compatibility, communication,
Boundaries and consent are implicitly subordinated to destiny. If the connection is from God, then questioning it risks appearing disobedient rather than discerning. At the same time, the narrative avoids all concrete specificity. No names, timelines, locations, or relational forms are given. The other chosen one could be a friend, partner, mentor, collaborator, or spiritual counterpart. This ambiguity is not accidental. It allows the listener to project their own unmet relational longings into the promise. Romantic desire, friendship hunger, spiritual companionship, or validation needs can all be mapped onto the same vague figure without contradiction. This open-endedness dramatically increases the narrative's reach. Any significant encounter the listener has in the future can be retrospectively interpreted as fulfillment. Alternatively, if no such encounter occurs, the promise remains intact because it was never temporally bound. Delay does not disprove it. Delay becomes further preparation. The future connection is always close enough to sustain hope, yet distant enough to avoid falsification. Functionally, this move replaces present lack with future certainty. The listener's current loneliness no longer needs to be resolved now because it has already been answered later. Emotional deprivation is tolerated because it has been given a countdown. This reduces pressure on the narrative to provide immediate relief or practical support. The listener is encouraged to endure rather than address their present relational reality. Importantly, this promised fulfillment preserves the chosen identity while resolving its main cost. Earlier sections establish that being chosen requires isolation. This creates a problem. Permanent chosenness would mean permanent loneliness. The future connection solves this by promising exclusivity without abandonment. The listener will not return to the masses. They will meet another chosen one. Belonging is restored, but only within the in-group. This maintains the hierarchy while alleviating emotional strain. The narrative also subtly discourages organic relational development. Because the coming connection is divinely appointed, relationships formed through ordinary social processes may feel provisional, inferior, or even suspicious. The listener may hesitate to invest fully in present relationships, waiting instead for the real alignment. This deferral keeps emotional energy suspended and available for the promised future, rather than grounded in present reality. Another key function is the removal of discernment responsibility.
Because the connection is framed as pre-approved by heaven, the listener is not positioned as an active evaluator. Discernment is replaced by recognition. The right person will feel right, click, or be confirmed by signs and synchronicities. This reduces the need for critical assessment and increases reliance on internal sensation and narrative cues. The promise also creates a self-reinforcing expectancy loop. Once the listener believes a destined meeting is approaching, they begin scanning their environment for confirmation. Coincidences, emotional resonance, or symbolic parallels can be interpreted as evidence. Each near miss or ambiguous encounter strengthens anticipation rather than weakening belief. The future relationship becomes a lens through which experience is filtered. Notably, the narrative never defines what happens if the relationship fails. Conflict, incompatibility, or harm are structurally excluded from consideration. If difficulties arise, they can be reinterpreted as tests, warfare, or refinement, rather than indicators of misalignment. This protects the promise from negative outcomes by absorbing them into the same explanatory framework. Emotionally, this section performs a powerful hope transfer. The listener's longing is no longer directed toward vague relief or self-directed change, but toward a specific narrative endpoint. This concentrates emotional investment and increases retention. Leaving the narrative would now mean risking the loss of a promised fulfillment that has been framed as singular and irreplaceable. In summary, this function introduces future relational fulfillment
in a way that is emotionally potent, yet structurally insulated. By announcing a divinely appointed connection without details, the narrative maximizes projection, minimizes risk, and sustains hope indefinitely. Present loneliness is made bearable, agency is deferred, and belonging is promised without ever needing to materialize.
Destiny is no longer solitary, but it remains safely out of reach, keeping the listener oriented forward and attached. This section escalates the narrative by transforming ordinary relational partnership into a cosmic force multiplier. The listener's individual strength is acknowledged first, but only as a setup. Alone, they are already powerful, but not powerful enough. This framing is deliberate. It affirms the listener's ego, while simultaneously creating a sense of incompletion that can only be resolved through the promised alignment. The key move here is the use of exponential logic instead of additive logic. Partnership is not described as cooperation, support, or shared labor. It is described as multiplication. One person does not become two, one becomes 1,000. Two do not become double, they become 10,000. This arithmetic framing detaches authority from effort, skill, strategy, or sustained work. Power is no longer something cultivated over time, it is something unlocked instantly through alignment. Scriptural numerics are central to this effect. The numbers themselves carry symbolic weight even for listeners with minimal theological literacy. They feel ancient, sanctioned, and authoritative. Because the math is presented as scripture-derived, it bypasses scrutiny. No one is expected to ask why 1 equals 1,000 or how agreement produces 10,000. The numbers function rhetorically, not logically. Precision simulates truth. This numerical framing also performs an important psychological function. It compresses the cost-reward ratio. Years of loneliness, suffering, and preparation are suddenly justified if the payoff is exponential impact. The listener is led to believe that their long endurance will be redeemed not proportionally, but overwhelmingly. This retroactively sanctifies deprivation. Whatever was lost is now reframed as negligible compared to what is allegedly coming. Notably, effort is almost entirely removed from the equation. Spiritual authority is not earned through discipline, ethical consistency, or communal accountability. It is activated through agreement. Agreement itself is treated as a mystical switch. Once flipped, power flows automatically. This is appealing because it preserves dignity while minimizing responsibility. The listener does not need to change behavior. They only need to align correctly. The narrative then introduces enemy fear as external validation. Darkness, the enemy, or spiritual forces are said to be terrified of this union. This serves two purposes at once. First, it inflates importance. If the enemy fears you, you must matter. Second, it preemptively reframes doubt or resistance as opposition rather than discernment. Any internal hesitation can be recoded as spiritual attack rather than a rational response. Enemy fear also solves a structural problem. If the promised alignment has not yet occurred, the delay can be blamed on interference. Separation is no longer unfortunate. It is strategic warfare. This prevents the listener from concluding that nothing is actually happening. Something is happening. It is just being resisted because it is so dangerous to darkness. The union itself is framed as a threat, not merely a blessing. This is crucial. Being a threat feels more meaningful than being helped. It positions the listener not as a recipient, but as a weapon. The relationship is no longer about mutual care or relational health. It is about impact, territory, and power. This appeals strongly to individuals whose pain has been reframed as preparation for battle. At the same time, this threat framing discourages relational realism. Ordinary challenges, miscommunication, incompatibility, boundaries, do not fit easily into a story where the relationship is divinely weaponized. If conflict arises, it can be interpreted as spiritual resistance rather than a sign of misalignment. This protects the narrative from relational failure by externalizing all friction.
Another subtle effect is the inflation of identity through proximity. The listener's significance increases not because of who they are becoming, but because of who they will stand next to. Power is relational, but not reciprocal. It is catalytic. The other chosen one functions less as a person and more as an amplifier. This reduces the complexity of relationship to a single variable, combined force. This framing also intensifies emotional investment. If partnership equals exponential authority, then missing or mishandling the alignment feels catastrophic. The listener becomes motivated not just to hope for connection, but to guard it obsessively. This can foster vigilance, suspicion of alternatives, and heightened sensitivity to signs and symbols, all of which deepen dependence on the narrative. In essence, this function inflates perceived significance by converting relationship into math, destiny into arithmetic, and authority into inevitability. The listener is no longer one person seeking connection. They are half of a coming equation that will terrify darkness itself. The promise is grand, abstract, and unfalsifiable, but emotionally potent. Power is no longer something to build. It is something waiting to be unlocked as soon as the right person arrives. This function marks the pivot point where belief stops being purely internal and is translated into visible, trackable behavior. Up to this stage, the narrative has worked on identity, chosen one, meaning, your suffering had purpose, and anticipation, something is coming. Here, those internal states are operationalized. The viewer is no longer just a listener. They are subtly enlisted as a participant whose actions are framed as spiritually consequential. The first move is the ritualization of trivial actions. Commenting numbers like 111, 222, or 333 is framed not as audience interaction, but as prophetic agreement. This matters because it bypasses rational evaluation.
Typing a number requires no belief verification, no doctrinal understanding, and no risk. Yet it is described as a binding spiritual act. The simplicity lowers resistance, while the framing inflates significance. A low-cost behavior is assigned high metaphysical weight. Crucially, the numbers themselves are semantically empty but symbolically loaded. They have no fixed meaning within the video. Instead, they function as containers for projection. The viewer fills them with intention, readiness, agreement, discernment, alignment. This makes the act feel personal, even though it is standardized. Everyone types the same thing, but each person experiences it as uniquely expressive of their inner state. This mechanism mirrors religious ritual without institutional accountability. There is no priest, no sacrament, no doctrine, only the act and its interpretation. Because the ritual is self-administered and publicly visible, it creates a sense of commitment without oversight. Once someone comments, they have externalized belief, making it psychologically harder to disengage later without experiencing dissonance. The next layer is the spiritualization of platform mechanics. Likes, subscriptions, and shares are not framed as supporting a creator or algorithmic distribution. They are reframed as obedience, alignment, or participation in divine movement. This recontextualization is critical. Ordinary skepticism toward engagement bait is neutralized because the action is no longer about the platform, it is about destiny. By doing this, the narrative collapses the boundary between spiritual obedience and digital behavior. Scrolling away becomes disobedience, staying becomes faithfulness, sharing becomes ministry. The platform itself is recoded as a spiritual arena rather than a commercial one. This allows the creator to extract engagement
while appearing spiritually selfless, because the benefit is framed as communal or cosmic rather than personal.
The viewer is then elevated into the role of co-agent. They are told they may be the vessel God uses to awaken another chosen one. This is psychologically powerful for two reasons. First, it transforms passive consumption into mission. Second, it redistributes responsibility. If others remain asleep, the viewer may feel accountable for not sharing. The act of sharing is no longer optional generosity. It becomes moral participation. This also creates a self-replicating recruitment loop. Every viewer is subtly deputized as a messenger. The narrative spreads not because of persuasion, but because of obligation. Importantly, the viewer is never asked to explain or defend the message, only to transmit it. This avoids cognitive strain while maximizing reach. At the same time, the creator avoids appearing authoritarian by framing all actions as voluntary agreement. The viewer is not commanded. They are invited to declare readiness, agreement, or faith. But the emotional framing ensures that refusal carries an implicit cost. Hesitation signals unreadiness, doubt, or resistance. Freedom is preserved on the surface, while pressure operates underneath. Another key outcome is the construction of a parasocial in-group. Comment sections filled with repeating numbers, affirmations, and shared language give the illusion of a community of equals. Yet, this community is asymmetrical. Members rarely interact meaningfully with each other. Their primary relationship is vertical, toward the speaker. The shared rituals create belonging without horizontal accountability. The label "chosen ones" functions as a boundary marker. Participation signals inclusion. Silence risks exclusion. Over time, this can shift identity from someone watching a video to member of a spiritually awakened group. Once identity is tied to participation, disengagement threatens not just belief, but belonging. This structure also discourages critical reflection. If engagement is obedience, then questioning motives, techniques, or accuracy can feel like spiritual rebellion rather than intellectual discernment. Doubt is not debated. It is bypassed by action. The viewer is kept moving, commenting, liking, sharing, leaving little space to step back and evaluate the system itself. Notably, the actions required are non-falsifiable. Typing a number cannot be proven effective or ineffective. Sharing a video cannot be directly linked to outcomes. This protects the narrative from disconfirmation. If nothing changes, the explanation is never that the system is false. It is that alignment is still unfolding, timing is in progress, or faith must be maintained. In summary, this function converts belief into action by assigning sacred meaning to trivial behaviors, merging spiritual obedience with platform engagement, elevating the viewer into a missionary role, creating public micro-commitments that reinforce identity, building a parasocial community defined by ritual participation. The result is a feedback loop where belief motivates action, action reinforces identity, and identity deepens belief, all while serving the structural needs of the platform and the creator. The viewer feels active, chosen, and obedient, even though the primary output is attention, engagement, and distribution rather than tangible spiritual formation or relational grounding. This function works by anchoring a future partnership in sacred history, making relational desire appear obedient rather than needy. Instead of framing connection as a response to loneliness or limitation, it is reframed as participation in a divine pattern that already carries authority. The listener is not seeking companionship. They are aligning with precedent. The first move is recasting Jesus through selective emphasis. Jesus is presented not primarily as solitary, transcendent, or self-sufficient, but as someone who chose disciples. This framing quietly shifts the implication. If even Jesus operated relationally, then partnership cannot signal weakness. Dependence is replaced with strategy. Relationship is no longer a concession to human fragility, but a deliberate structural choice within divine operations. Crucially, the narrative avoids saying Jesus needed disciples emotionally. Instead, it implies functional necessity, mission, multiplication, witness. This distinction matters. Emotional need might undermine authority, but strategic partnership enhances it. By positioning discipleship as operational rather than relational, the listener is taught that pairing does not diminish calling, it scales it. Next, pairing is framed as divine strategy, not human preference. The future relationship is not something the listener wants, it is something heaven has designed. This bypasses shame around desire while also bypassing agency.
If partnership is strategic, then questioning it becomes questioning God's method, not evaluating compatibility or readiness. Desire is sanctified, but discernment is outsourced. Authority is then redefined as alignment rather than transformation. The listener is not told they must heal more, mature more, or become more whole before partnership. Instead, authority flows from being positioned correctly within God's design. This is psychologically soothing. It removes the burden of self-work while preserving a sense of importance. You are not unfinished. You are simply not yet paired. This logic also preserves the narrative of chosenness. The partnership is not common or romantic in an ordinary sense. It is missional. Two people are joined not because they complement each other emotionally, but because together they fit a pattern God has used before. Moses and Aaron, David and Jonathan, Paul and Timothy. The specificity of these examples is less important than their symbolic function. History validates expectation. The listener is then positioned as a continuation of biblical pattern, not an exception. This is powerful because it collapses distance between ancient text and present self. Scripture is no longer descriptive, it is predictive. The listener's life is framed as the next chapter in an ongoing template. Their future relationship is not new, it is overdue. This move also protects the narrative from disappointment. If the partnership does not materialize as expected, the issue is never the premise. It is timing, readiness, or unseen preparation. Precedent cannot fail. It can only be delayed. The authority of Scripture is used as insulation against falsification. Finally, this function subtly normalizes dependency while disguising it as destiny. The listener is encouraged to await another person for full activation, but this waiting feels purposeful rather than passive. Longing becomes obedience. Incompleteness becomes anticipation. The narrative preserves dignity while quietly relocating power outside the self. In essence, legitimizing partnership through precedent achieves several things at once. It sanctifies desire without naming need.
It removes shame while suspending agency. It borrows authority from Scripture to validate expectation. It reframes waiting as alignment, not lack. The listener is left feeling faithful rather than unfinished, significant rather than lonely, and positioned within a divine pattern that feels too ancient and too authoritative to question. This function operates by offering transformation while withholding process. It satisfies the listener's hunger for resolution without burdening them with explanation, effort, or risk. Breakthrough is guaranteed, but its mechanics remain intentionally opaque. What matters is not how change happens, but that it is already underway and unstoppable. The central claim is that meeting triggers access. Destiny is described as layered, some parts available now, others sealed until a specific relational or spiritual convergence occurs. The listener is told they have reached the limit of solitary progress. Further advancement is not blocked by lack of discipline, skill, or insight, but by missing alignment. This reframing absolves the listener of responsibility while preserving hope. Stagnation is not failure,
it is proof that the next level requires a different key. Crucially, this key is not effort-based, it is encounter-based. Something or someone will arrive that unlocks what has remained inaccessible. This removes the need for strategy or preparation. Growth no longer depends on practice, learning, or structural change. It depends on recognition. Destiny is not built, it is activated. Acceleration is then framed as supernatural rather than practical. Time does not speed up because systems improve or habits change, but because alignment collapses resistance. The listener is taught that when heaven approves, friction disappears. Processes that normally take years will resolve in weeks. Delays dissolve not through optimization, but through authorization. This creates a powerful emotional payoff. Long frustration is promised sudden relief without the discomfort of incremental work. By removing practical causality, the narrative also removes accountability. If acceleration is supernatural, failure cannot be attributed to poor planning or unrealistic expectations. Any absence of progress must therefore mean alignment has not yet occurred, or that the listener must wait slightly longer. The promise remains intact regardless of outcome. Effort is consistently minimized while alignment is maximized. Action is subtly redefined as interference. Trying too hard is portrayed as evidence of misalignment, not diligence. Rest, silence, and patience are elevated as higher forms of obedience. This has a calming effect. Exhaustion is validated, and ambition is softened. The listener is no longer striving toward breakthrough, they are positioning themselves to receive it. This positioning requires remarkably little. Often, it involves attention, belief, and restraint. Do not force, do not chase, do not explain, just stay available. This preserves a sense of participation without requiring tangible change. The listener feels involved, but not overburdened. They are doing enough simply by waiting correctly. Delay is then reinterpreted as build-up rather than obstruction. Time is not wasted, it is compressing value. The longer the wait, the greater the release. This logic converts disappointment into anticipation. Missed opportunities, stagnant seasons, and emotional fatigue are retroactively reframed as pressure accumulating behind a dam. When the breakthrough finally comes, it will justify everything that preceded it. This reinterpretation is emotionally potent because it redeems pain without resolving it. Suffering does not need to end yet. It only needs to be meaningful. The listener is encouraged to endure ambiguity because it will magnify reward. Questioning the delay becomes a sign of short-sightedness. Faith is defined as the willingness to wait without clarity. Momentum is ultimately framed as inevitable.
Once alignment occurs, once the meeting happens, once the authorization is released, events will move on their own. Doors will open without knocking. Recognition will replace obscurity. Progress will feel effortless, almost passive. The listener will not need to convince, pursue, or prove. Things will fall into place. This inevitability serves an important psychological function. It collapses anxiety about the future. If momentum is guaranteed, then vigilance is unnecessary. The listener can relax into expectancy. At the same time, inevitability discourages critical evaluation. If success is certain, there is no need to ask whether the framework itself is sound. The absence of mechanics also protects the narrative from falsification. Because no specific steps are outlined, nothing can be measured or disproven. If the breakthrough does not occur, the explanation is never that the promise was false. It is always that timing is still unfolding, alignment is still forming, or unseen factors are still resolving. The promise adapts to every outcome. Importantly, this function preserves dignity while suspending agency.
The listener is not portrayed as lazy or incapable. They are portrayed as chosen for a kind of breakthrough that cannot be earned. Their role is not to build the future, but to be ready for it. Readiness is internal, subjective, and impossible to verify, making it both comforting and binding. There is also a subtle elevation of identity. The listener is not just someone awaiting improvement. They are someone on the verge of activation. Their current life may look ordinary or stalled, but this is framed as camouflage. Real momentum is invisible until it is released all at once. This keeps self-image intact, even in the absence of evidence. The promise of breakthrough without mechanics ultimately creates a closed loop of expectation. Hope is sustained without progress. Meaning is generated without change. Waiting becomes the work, and belief becomes the proof. The listener is emotionally fed while structurally immobilized. In summary, this function achieves several key outcomes. It guarantees transformation while avoiding explanation. It absolves the listener of responsibility without stripping significance. It reframes delay as value accumulation rather than dysfunction. It converts passivity into virtue through the language of alignment. It renders the promise unfalsifiable by removing measurable criteria. Breakthrough is always near, always imminent, always justified by what has already been endured. The listener is not asked to understand the path, only to trust that it exists, that it is active, and that when it finally reveals itself, it will make sense of everything retroactively. Here, belief is no longer something the listener holds. It becomes something the listener lives inside. The narrative quietly steps out of the video frame and installs itself into the texture of daily experience, until ordinary life itself begins to speak the language of destiny. It begins with sleep. Dreams, which already arrive without permission and resist control, are reframed as intentional transmissions rather than psychological residue. What was once dismissed as stress, memory, or imagination is elevated into prophetic rehearsal. The listener is taught that the subconscious is not wandering, but receiving. Images do not need clarity to carry authority. A face without a name, a place without geography, a conversation that ends before it resolves. These are not failures of meaning, but evidence that the revelation is still loading. Crucially, the dream is never required to be verifiable. It is private, intimate, immune to contradiction. The listener becomes both recipient and validator. Even confusion is sanctified. If the dream feels fragmented, that means the future is too large to be shown all at once. If it feels emotional but incoherent, that is proof it bypassed the intellect. Interpretation is encouraged, but resolution is deferred. The dream does not conclude. It promises continuation. Waking life then inherits this logic. Repeating numbers begin to surface, not because they are rare, but because attention has been trained to notice them. A clock, a receipt, a license plate. The narrative does not argue for their significance. It assumes it. Numbers carry a veneer of objectivity. They feel precise, mathematical, indisputable. And yet, they explain nothing. They do not reveal cause or mechanism. They simply appear, and appearance is enough. This is the genius of the symbol. It offers certainty without accountability. Seeing the number becomes the confirmation. Not seeing it never becomes disproof. The world is converted into a quiet signaling system where affirmation accumulates, but doubt dissolves. The listener learns to scan reality for reassurance, and reality obliges, not because it is changed, but because perception has. The body follows. Restlessness is no longer discomfort, it is motion. Emotional volatility is no longer instability, it is recalibration.
Sleeplessness is not imbalance, but anticipation. The narrative absorbs sensations that might otherwise demand reflection or intervention and repurposes them as spiritual weather. Something is shifting, the listener is told. That is why peace feels elusive. Comfort would mean stagnation. Disruption means movement. This reframing is soothing and consuming at the same time. It relieves the listener of self-blame while discouraging inquiry. The question is no longer, what is happening to me, but what is about to happen for me? Anxiety becomes expectation. Confusion becomes transition. Exhaustion becomes evidence that something old is dissolving. Then the world itself begins to participate. A song plays at the right moment. A conversation echoes an unspoken thought. A delay prevents an encounter that would have gone badly. A missed opportunity is reclassified as protection. Nothing is neutral anymore. Every event is potentially intentional. Life becomes semiotic, a field of signs rather than causes. This is not presented as superstition, but as awakening. The listener is told they are finally seeing how things truly work. Randomness is an illusion for the uninitiated. For the aligned, everything is curated. Even disappointment is absorbed. A closed door is not failure, but redirection. Silence is not absence, but preparation. Waiting is not stagnation, but accumulation. Over time, ambiguity itself becomes sacred. The lack of specificity that would normally trigger skepticism is reframed as proof of depth. If the message were clear, it would be ordinary. If the timing were exact, it would be mechanical. Mystery protects magnitude. The listener learns that clarity would cheapen the process. Questions are not answered. They are honored as signs of proximity to revelation. This inversion is subtle but powerful. Doubt is no longer a tool for discernment. It becomes a sign of misalignment. Certainty is not intellectual confidence, but emotional resonance. If something feels significant, it is significant. If it unsettles, it is working. If it cannot be explained, it must be real. In this environment, belief no longer requires reinforcement from the speaker. The listener's own life now generates the evidence. Dreams validate numbers. Numbers validate restlessness. Restlessness validates delay. Delay validates destiny. The system feeds itself. And because the evidence is experiential rather than factual, it cannot be argued away. To question the narrative would require reinterpreting one's own emotions, perceptions, and private meanings. That cost is high. It feels like betrayal, not of an idea, but of one's own inner life. The result is a quiet psychological enclosure, not coercive, not overt, but immersive. The listener is not told to disengage from reality. They are told reality has finally begun to speak. Belief extends beyond the message, because the message has taught the listener how to see. And once seeing itself is framed as proof, belief no longer needs to be chosen. It simply continues. And as this way of seeing settles in, it begins to reorganize responsibility without ever naming itself as control. When meaning is everywhere, choice quietly narrows. The listener no longer asks whether to interpret an event spiritually, only how. To treat something as ordinary starts to feel like blindness. To dismiss a coincidence feels like regression. The narrative does not forbid alternative explanations. It simply renders them spiritually inferior. Psychological explanations become shallow. Social explanations become incomplete. Structural explanations feel cold. Spiritual framing, by contrast, feels intimate, alive, personal. This creates a subtle dependency, not on the speaker directly, but on the interpretive lens the speaker has installed.
Everyday decisions are now filtered through anticipation. Should I go there? Should I message this person? Should I wait? The answer is rarely decide. It is discern. And discernment, in this framework, does not mean evaluating evidence or outcomes. It means scanning for internal signals, peace, resistance, restlessness, resonance. The self becomes both compass and terrain, but without an external standard to challenge misreadings. Importantly, misinterpretation is never acknowledged as a possibility. Only impatience is. If nothing happens, it is not because the interpretation was wrong. It is because the timing was not ripe. If an expectation collapses, it was a counterfeit. If anticipation stretches on painfully long, that pain itself becomes confirmation that something enormous is being withheld just out of sight. The future is always intact. Only access is delayed. This protects the narrative from erosion. Over time, the listener's relationship with uncertainty changes. Uncertainty is no longer a space for inquiry or experimentation. It becomes a sacred holding pattern. Waiting is moralized. Action without confirmation feels dangerous. Stillness becomes obedience. Movement requires permission, not from reason, but from a feeling interpreted as divine clearance. The world continues to produce mixed signals, because it always does. But the narrative teaches the listener how to sort them without friction. Positive events are signs. Negative events are tests.
Neutral events are distractions. There is no residue left over that demands reinterpretation of the system itself. Even contradictions are absorbed. If two signs conflict, it is spiritual warfare. If peace and anxiety coexist, it is the old resisting the new. If excitement fades, it was premature anticipation. If nothing aligns, alignment is happening invisibly. The framework is elastic enough to stretch around any outcome without tearing. And because the listener's inner life is constantly being affirmed, your sensitivity is real, your perception is heightened, your experience matters. The cost of stepping outside the narrative grows heavier with time. Leaving would not just mean rejecting a message. It would mean reclassifying months of feelings, patterns, hopes, and interpretations as coincidence or projection. That reclassification would feel like loss. So belief extends not through pressure, but through continuity. The listener is not held by fear of punishment, but by fear of meaninglessness. The narrative promises that nothing was wasted. No pain, no waiting, no confusion. Everything fits. Everything is accounted for. To exit would be to reopen the possibility that some things simply hurt without purpose, that some loneliness was not strategic, that some waiting led nowhere. That possibility is far more unsettling than staying. In this way, daily life becomes the reinforcement mechanism, not the speaker, not the platform, the calendar, the body, the dream state, the street, the phone screen, all participate. The listener no longer needs to be persuaded. They are already interpreting. Belief does not need to be renewed because it is no longer episodic. It is ambient. And that is the final transformation. The message ends, but the meaning does not. The video closes, but the narrative remains active, quietly translating reality into destiny, moment by moment, without ever needing to announce itself again. This phase of the narrative functions as an insurance policy. Once anticipation has been raised and relational fulfillment promised, doubt becomes the primary threat. Not because doubt disproves the story, but because it interrupts emotional momentum. To neutralize that threat, the framework introduces an adversary who is not chaotic, but intelligent. The enemy is no longer a vague force of evil. It is a strategist. Calculated, observant, reactive. This immediately explains why things might go wrong without ever challenging the structure of the message itself. If a connection fails, it is not because the premise was flawed, it is because the enemy intervened. The introduction of counterfeits is especially effective. It retroactively reframes disappointment as confirmation. A relationship that felt intense but collapsed was not a misreading, it was a test. A person who mirrored spiritual language but caused harm was not evidence of projection, they were a decoy. The listener is never wrong, only targeted. Discernment is preserved symbolically, while its actual accuracy becomes irrelevant. Speed, pressure, and flattery are defined in advance as danger signals. On the surface, this appears protective. In practice, it creates a paradox. Any relationship that moves quickly can be dismissed as counterfeit. Any relationship that moves slowly can be framed as divinely timed. Any discomfort can be interpreted as spiritual resistance. Any excitement can be framed as confirmation. The criteria are elastic enough to fit any outcome. When something fails, responsibility is displaced outward. The listener is not asked to examine their expectations, attachment patterns, boundaries, or interpretation biases. Instead, failure is attributed to deception. This preserves self-image and emotional investment at the same time. The pain of loss is acknowledged, but the source of that pain is reassigned to an external agent rather than internal misjudgment or structural flaws in the narrative. This is where unfalsifiability is sealed.
If a connection succeeds, the prophecy is fulfilled. If it fails, it was a counterfeit. If nothing happens, preparation is still underway. If waiting becomes exhausting, it is because the enemy is delaying what matters most. There is no scenario in which the core claim is allowed to be questioned. Even discernment itself becomes circular. True discernment is defined as agreeing with the framework's conclusions. Disagreement is not skepticism. It is confusion. Hesitation is not caution. It is fear. Doubt is not inquiry. It is interference. The listener is subtly trained to distrust their own critical impulses while trusting emotional resonance as divine signal. Relational breakdowns are particularly vulnerable moments for narrative collapse. This section anticipates that risk and neutralizes it preemptively. When intimacy disappoints, the listener does not reassess the promise of inevitable alignment. They double down on vigilance. They become more alert, more guarded, more invested in identifying the real chosen one next time. This creates a loop of hope without accountability. Each failure sharpens the narrative rather than weakening it. Each loss is reframed as progress through elimination. Each disappointment becomes evidence that something authentic must still exist, otherwise the counterfeit would not be necessary. The enemy's activity paradoxically validates the importance of the mission. By externalizing error, the narrative avoids maturation. Growth would require integrating uncertainty, ambiguity, and self-reflection. Instead, the listener is offered protection without complexity. Pain is acknowledged, but its meaning is tightly managed. The result is stability without truth testing. The story never collapses because it never risks contact with falsification. Every outcome feeds it. Every contradiction strengthens it. The listener is left not with clarity, but with continuity. An interpretive shelter where belief can survive indefinitely, untouched by evidence, insulated from revision, and always one discernment away from fulfillment. This function completes the control loop by redefining what discernment means while preserving the appearance of autonomy. On the surface, the listener is encouraged to test, weigh, and confirm. Language like "pray about it," "seek peace," and "use discernment" signals maturity and responsibility. In practice, however, the criteria for testing are preloaded and tightly constrained. Only outcomes that affirm the narrative qualify as valid confirmation. Any conclusion that challenges it is quietly disqualified as fear, trauma, or spiritual interference. Peace becomes the most important mechanism here. Rather than being a complex, contextual, and sometimes ambiguous inner state, peace is narrowed into a single definition: emotional agreement with the message. If the listener feels calm while accepting the claim, that calm is labeled divine confirmation. If they feel tension, skepticism, or discomfort, that sensation is not explored. It is diagnosed. Unease is reframed as resistance, not insight. The possibility that discomfort might signal misalignment, projection, or manipulation is structurally removed. External counsel is permitted, but only conditionally. Trusted voices are encouraged in theory, yet disqualified in practice if they raise concerns. Anyone who questions the framework is positioned as lacking spiritual sensitivity, operating from fear, or unable to perceive what the listener has been chosen to receive. This creates a filter where agreement counts as wisdom and disagreement counts as blindness. Community exists, but only as an echo. Past wounds play a crucial role in enforcing this control. Instead of being healed through reflection and integration, they are repurposed as explanatory weapons.
If the listener hesitates, it is not because the claim is weak. It is because betrayal, rejection, or abandonment has damaged their trust. Hesitation becomes pathology. Acceptance becomes healing. This subtly pressures the listener to override caution in order to prove growth. Finally, responsibility is shifted upward rather than inward. Outcomes are no longer something the listener actively evaluates or shapes through judgment and agency. They are something managed by heaven, timing, and divine orchestration. If clarity is missing, it is not time yet. If confusion arises, God is still working. The listener's role is reduced to alignment and waiting, not interpretation and choice. What emerges is a closed interpretive system that feels empowering because it uses the language of discernment, maturity, and testing, but functions by narrowing meaning until only one conclusion feels safe. Agency is preserved symbolically, while responsibility for understanding is quietly outsourced. At this stage of the narrative, belief is no longer the primary objective. Commitment is. The content has already done the work of emotional attunement, identity inflation, and future projection. What remains is to close the loop by transforming inner resonance into outward action. This is where the system becomes self-reinforcing. The invitation to comment a number, to type Amen, or to publicly signal agreement is framed as spiritually neutral on the surface, even gentle. Yet structurally, it is one of the most decisive moments in the entire sequence. The act is redefined not as engagement, but as alignment. It is not respond if you feel like it, but respond if this is for you. That framing collapses ambiguity. The viewer is no longer asked whether the message is true, but whether they belong. Public declaration functions as a binding mechanism. Once belief is externalized, it acquires social weight. The viewer has now left a trace, however small, that can be returned to later. This matters because belief held privately can dissolve quietly, but belief declared publicly resists withdrawal. The human mind is wired to preserve coherence between past actions and present identity. By commenting, the viewer doesn't just express agreement, they record it. From that moment on, doubt would require revision not only of the message, but of the self-image that agreed with it. This is where silence becomes meaningful. Silence is no longer absence of action. It is reinterpreted as reluctance, fear, or resistance. The narrative does not state this overtly, but it implies it through contrast. Those who comment are praised as ready, aligned, courageous. Those who do not are implicitly positioned as hesitant, unprepared, or spiritually blocked. The viewer is placed under soft pressure. Act now or be classified by yourself as someone who missed the moment. The brilliance of this move lies in how it preserves the illusion of choice. The viewer technically can scroll away. Nothing forces them, but the emotional framing ensures that disengagement feels like loss. If the message is for you, then failing to respond becomes a rejection not of content, but of destiny. The cost of inaction is inflated beyond reason, while the cost of action is trivial. Typing a number takes seconds. Walking away feels permanent. At this point, reflection is no longer the desired outcome. Speed is. The narrative exploits heightened emotional arousal, hope, relief, validation, anticipation, and channels it toward immediate behavior. This is crucial. Emotional states decay quickly. If the viewer were encouraged to pause, sleep on it, or evaluate later, the spell would weaken. Instead, the structure urges immediate response, locking commitment in at the peak of emotional intensity. Engagement is then reframed as obedience. Likes and subscriptions are no longer platform mechanics. They are spiritual acts. Sharing the video is not distribution. It is participation in divine work. The viewer is elevated from consumer to co-agent. This reframing is essential because it removes the asymmetry between creator and audience. The speaker is no longer just delivering a message. They are mobilizing a collective. The viewer's identity shifts again, this time from chosen recipient to chosen carrier.